Shalom, everyone. We are starting a new series tonight, God willing, a 4-part series called The Aspects of Compassion and Principles of Faith. Why this subject at this time of year? As we will be learning at this time of year, what are called the 13 Midot HaRachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion, take a very, very important central part of our prayers, our consciousness. And really what sparked it was an article and then a teaching from Rav Ginsberg about the 13 aspects of compassion. And when I learned this, it was like, wow, this is our next mini series. So it was perfect. So tonight, I'll call this an introduction to the whole subject at hand. And that means is that I will be introducing a whole lot of ideas that we will be covering, but none of them in tremendous depths, because that's what the other 3 classes are about. So I'm going to start with the way that Rav Ginsberg started. And this is something that we're going to explore also, there's a very, very deep connection between the months of Av, Elul, and Tishrei. And we'll be learning different aspects of this flow of time, and especially as it leads towards Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and the holiday of Sukkot in Tishrei. There's a whole introductory flow into the energy of a new year. Even though it's still not even Rosh Chodesh Elul, it's already tradition to be greeting people with Shana Tova, with blessing people with a new year, because it's in the air. The feeling that a new energy is coming, a new year is coming, and this year is concluding. So Rav Ginsberg began this going all the way back to the 3 weeks. And he points out that there are 22 days between the fast days of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. Now, it's very, very important to understand that these 22 days, this cycle of 22 days, has a complementary cycle of 22 days, which is from Rosh Hashanah to Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah in Eretz Yisrael. Outside, there's 2 days, Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, so there's 23 days. But of course, all of the holidays are really meant to be celebrated in Israel. So we have a 22-day cycle, what's called the 3 weeks between 2 fast days, and the 22 days from Rosh Hashanah to Simchas Torah. There's a beautiful teaching from the Slikhaar Rabbi, who says that when an artist wants to make a drawing, so first they will make an outline, could even be a light outline in pencil, of what the picture ultimately will be. And only later do they come and they start filling in with colors. So the Slikhaar Rabbi said this is very similar to the 22 days between Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, where we begin to make an outline of the new year. And during the holidays of Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah through Simchas Torah, that's when we color in. It's a very, very potent metaphor, meaning that our introduction or our preparation for the new year begins with tears, begins with this idea that there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. And you know, the Arizal said, if someone doesn't cry at least one tear on Rosh Hashanah, in a way, they haven't really experienced Rosh Hashanah. It's called the Days of Awe. And he was promoting the idea that we should, to really feel that awe, should bring, it doesn't even have to be a physical tear, but on the inside at least, a true crying out, a true shedding of tears. So that's our introduction to a new year. We make the outline beginning with breaking, and then we fill it in with a whole heart. So Rav Ginsberg points out that in those 22 days, there are 13 of those days occur in the month of Tammuz, and 9 of the days occur in the month of Av. So he says this is a very, very important division of 13 and 9. And this is where he launches into the subject that we are going to be discussing and expanding on greatly over the next 4 weeks. He says that the 13 days in Tammuz represents the 13 aspects of compassion. And the 9 days of Av, now this is something that not everyone is aware of. There's also a second set of aspects of compassion, which are called the 9 aspects of compassion. And that occurs after the spies come back and they give a very negative report, and the people are crying at their tents. They're about to pick a new leader and go back to Egypt. Again, Moshe prays for compassion upon the people, for forgiveness. And there are 9 aspects of compassion. For those who want to look it up at a later date, it's in the 14th chapter of the book of Bamidbar, Numbers. It's the 14th chapter and the 18th verse, for those who want to look it up. And the 13 Midot of Rachamim occurs after the golden calf, where again, Moshe pleads for forgiveness, and God accepts it and reveals what are called Shlosh Esrei Midot HaRachamim, the 13 aspects of compassion or mercy. And that's in chapter 34, verse 6 and 7. 6 and 7. So Rav Ginsberg points out that the fast day of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz is for what? The first thing that happened is Moshe broke the tablets. And what followed was the revelation of the 13 Midot HaRachamim. So the 13 days of Tammuz that are part of the 3 weeks, well, that's how we start the 3 weeks, is with a fast day for everything that happened in Yud Zayin B'Tammuz, but the first thing was the breaking of the tablets. And the second period, the 9 days of Av, so this, on Tisha B'Av, that first Tisha B'Av, that's when the people stood at their tent and cried, we can't go to Israel, let's go back to Egypt. So here, Rav Ginsberg points out, it's a very simple idea, but it's an amazing idea, that we have the 2 sets of aspects of compassion in the 3 weeks and representing the 2 times that they occur in the Torah. Now, I'm going to mention now another thing, and this is something that we will definitely go over. There's really a second set of 13 principles or aspects of compassion, and that is in the book of Micha. I don't have the exact chapter in front of me. We'll get to that. And that is recited on Rosh Hashanah at the ceremony called Tashlich. Again, all of this we will be going over again. And this is a second set of aspects of compassion revealed by the prophet Micha. And it has a very, very prominent place in Rosh Hashanah when we do Tashlich, where we go to a body of water and we symbolically throw our sins in the water to be taken away. And there we recite the 13 aspects of compassion from the book of Micha. So now to return to a deeper teaching from Rav Ginsberg here. This is amazing. So he says that in modern times, and we'll call this the last, good, Shlomo just posted in the chat exactly where in Micha. Thank you very much. So we'll call the last 1,000 years or the last 800 years the modern era. Because here we're talking about Kabbalah. And Rav Ginsberg said that in the last really 800 years, there were two personalities that shone in Kabbalah. One was Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, referred to as the Ramak, and of course the Arizal. So he points out an amazing thing, that the Yurtzeit, the day that the Ramak passed away, was the 23rd of Tammuz, which is the middle day of the 13 days of Tammuz. It's the middle day. It's the seventh day of the 3 weeks. And the Arizal, approximately 2 to 3 years later, passed away on Hey Av, which is the middle day of the 9 days of Av. And not only that, but they are buried one next to the other. The Ari is on the higher position, and at his feet is the Ramak. The Ramak was buried first, and above him was the Arizal. So Rav Ginsberg points out that these two personalities, because they're both in the middle of the 13 and the 9. And he says, he mentions that in the temple that Solomon built, Shlomo HaMelech, he placed 2 pillars. Now the pillars were not there to hold up anything. We'll call them, they were decorative pillars. One was called Yachin, he gave them names, Yachin and Boaz. Yachin means to prepare, and Boaz means strength. This is who Ruth married, was Boaz, and it means from strength. And Shlomo Melech placed these 2 pillars. So Rav Ginsberg made like an amazing drasha, because these 2 great personalities in Kabbalah were like the middle pillars of the 13 days of Tammuz and the 9 days of Av. They're like the pillars of Kabbalah. I just thought this was just like a very graphic metaphor to think of the Ramak and the Arizal. Now, I'm going to mention it here, and we're going to spend a whole class on this. Rav Ginsberg continued, and he mentioned that the number 13, of course, is a very, very important number. The number of unity, one, echad, Hashem echad. Echad equals 13. There, of course, is the idea that love, the word ahava, equals 13. And there are, according to the inner dimensions of the Sefirot, there are 13 levels of the Sefirot, even though we always talk about the 10 Sefirot. But on the inner, what's called the inner dimensions of the Sefirot, and we had a whole series, and many of you were there, and we discussed many, many times how we come to 13, because there are 3 aspects of Keter. And when you add Keter and Dot, there's 13 levels. But Rav Ginsberg says that there's another very, very important 13, and that is that the Rambam, Maimonides, so he created 13 principles of faith. Now, you can hear from this article how I came up with this mini-series called the aspects of compassion and principles of faith. So we are going to delve somewhat into the 13 principles of faith of Rambam, because of why did the Rambam pick 13? He could have picked another number, but as we will be learning, the 13 midot of rachamim are so important, and they're so important to this time of year that there are special prayers that we say before Rosh Hashanah. Sephardic Jews will start saying them already in the beginning of Elul, the entire month, and they're called Slichot. They're special prayers of asking for forgiveness. And Ashkenazim start anywhere from 4 to 7 days before, or even more, actually it could be 8 or 9 days before Rosh Hashanah. And the main part of Slichot are the 13 midot rachamim. That is the centerpiece of Slichot. And we say it on Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur at Ne'ilah over and over and over again before what's called the closing of the gates. So we have the 13 midot of rachamim. So Rav Ginsberg says an amazing thing. And like I said, hopefully we will spend an entire class on this. So he said that since there are 13 midot of rachamim, and there are 9 midot of rachamim, which of course we're going to learn more about. So he said like this is a very creative idea. He said that just like there are 13 principles of faith created by Rambam, so Rav Ginsberg created 9 principles of faith of Chassidut. This is an incredibly innovative idea. He said, if you look at all of Chassidut, just like the Rambam looked at all of Judaism, and he tried to distill 9 principles that are the foundation, the bedrock of Jewish belief, Jewish faith. So Rav Ginsberg has come up with 9 principles of Chassidut. And we're going to be spending a whole week learning these because they're quite fascinating, quite fascinating. But now let's continue with the overview of what we will be discussing. So we mentioned already that there is a second set of 13 principles of mercy or compassion from the prophet Micha. And we already mentioned the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. Remember, he's one of the pillars of Kabbalah. And so one of his very, very famous books is called Tomer Devorah. And actually, I exchanged something with Brenda today about Tomer Devorah. And I said I would be mentioning it. So it's a relatively small book, relatively. And what he does is he takes the 13 aspects of compassion from Micha, which are relate to God, God's aspects of compassion. But in this book, it's a classic book, I have gone through it, and I know my wife had a learning partner, and they must have spent like a half a year going through it word by word. But what he does is something amazing. Is there is a mitzvah in the Torah to emulate God. And the sages say, just like he is compassionate, you should be compassionate. And it mentions a few other, what we would call attributes of God. Just like God is gracious, Hanun, you should also be gracious. So Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, he goes through these 13 aspects of compassion of God, but he explains how we can integrate and emulate these ideas in our lives. And so it's a classic book. It's a very, very important book. And it's from Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, as we mentioned before. Okay, so now a little bit Kabbalistically about the 13 Midot of Rachamim. In Kabbalah, they have another name. They're called the 13 Tikkunei Dikna, the 13 rectifications of the beard. Dikna in Aramaic is the beard. What is the meaning of this? A symbolic meaning. So just like, I'll show it graphically, just like a beard is taking from the head and like drawing down the upper consciousness into the lower body. So the 13 Midot of Rachamim represent a lot more than just aspects of compassion. They represent, like we said before, that there are 13 inner dimensions of the Sefirot. And so these 13 Midot of Rachamim are drawing down not just Rachamim, but God's light into the lower worlds. So this expands greatly our understanding of the importance of the 13 Midot of Rachamim. Now, we mentioned Tomer Devorah from the Ramak. So now I want to mention something about the Arizal that's connected to what we're talking about. Pardon me for 1 second. Okay, so what I'm going to give over now for those who follow 70 Faces, we actually learned this. This was in a previous, maybe 2-3 months ago, about how many words in a verse. So when it comes to Hanukkah, so we make the first night of Hanukkah, we make 3 blessings. And every night after that, we make 2 blessings. And one is on lighting the candles, and one is on the miracles. And the first night is Shechianu, when something new in the year. So in the blessing that we say every night as we light the candles, so it's Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Olam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. God who has commanded us to light the lights of Hanukkah. So there's 14 words in that blessing. The Ari came and he took out the word shell. And that's why to this day, Hasidim and Sfardim take out, don't say the word shell. Ashkenazim say the word shell. There's no right or wrong here. This is not a matter of right or wrong. But the question is, why did the Arizal take out the word shell? So he wanted there to be 13 words in the blessing. And this is connected to what we're learning about right now. When you take out the word shell, the last 3 words is lahadlik ner Hanukkah. The first letters, lahadlik is a lamed, nun for ner, chet for Hanukkah. If you permute those letters, you get the word nachal, a stream, a river, a stream. So the Arizal gave over an incredible, we'll call it visualization. He said that when we light the candles or the oil of Hanukkah, so our light is going up. But we should envision that as we are lighting our light from below, that, and this is what he says, that we should visualize standing in a waterfall, a nachal of God's light and compassion. And that's why the Ari took out the word shell, because he wanted the blessing to be 13 words to represent the flow of compassion, of mercy, of light into the world. So this is a bit of an expanded idea of the 13 midot of rachamim. And we'll add here that Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who later changed his name to Evan Yisrael, who passed away this year. He was one of the great luminaries of this last century. Tremendous scholar and light in Israel. So his first book in English, he wrote scores of books that came out in English. And of course, he was the first to take the Talmud and to try to present it in a way that would be more understandable to people who were not totally versed in Talmudic logic and the language. Later, Art Scroll came and, of course, created the amazing Art Scroll Talmud. But Rav Steinsaltz was the first. He was absolutely the first. Anyways, his first book in English is called The 13-Petal Rose. Many people have it. Many people have heard of it. The 13-Petal Rose. And in the preface of the book, so he takes from the Zohar and he explains what is the symbolism of the 13-petal rose. So he says clearly, the Zohar says, these are the 13 midot of rachamim. That's the 13-petal rose. And actually, when you look at a rose, there's like 13 petals. And underneath, the Zohar also mentions that there are 5 leaves that come out from the stem that in a sense hold up the 13-petal rose. And these are the 5, what are called dinim, the 5 aspects of gevura. So the Zohar says that the rose represents both the gevura, the judgment, the aspects of judgment, and the aspects of compassion. And the Jewish people are referred to as the rose. Now, for those who were here when we played the song in the beginning, so the verse is, Ani l'dodi v'dodi li haro'eh b'shoshanim. I am to my beloved, and my beloved is to me, who pastures among the roses. So Rav Ginsberg explains that the word haro'eh, who pastures, in Aramaic, the word for will is rava, rava de ravin. So he says that the word in Aramaic for will is very close to the word to shepherd in Hebrew. And the shoshanim are the roses here. So it's understood, I am to my beloved and my beloved is to me, that God wills that there should be compassion upon his people. This is the way that the Kabbalah understands this verse. Now, all of this is we're just expanding the idea of the significance of the 13 aspects of compassion. Okay, so I mentioned in the beginning, and I do want to spend a little bit of time on this, that there's a deep connection between the month of Av, Elul, and Tishrei. And there's a flow happening. And actually on Shabbat, I was in Tzfat, and I was privileged to give over an hour class about this time of the year, this flow. I'm going to take some of the, I'll call it the pearls or the gems of this idea. And we're going to focus mostly on the idea of 13 and 9, because those are two sets of rachamim, of compassion from the Torah. And as we mentioned, the prophet Micha gives over a second set of 13. But here in the Torah, we have two sets of compassion, 13 and 9. And of course, it adds up to 22, which is connected to the 22 letters. So on the level of 13, so as I mentioned already, for Sfardim, the whole month of Elul, they'll be reciting Slikhaar every evening or early in the morning, depending on the congregation. And here in Israel, it's a yearly tradition that as we get closer to Rosh Hashanah, virtually every yeshiva and seminary in Israel goes to the kotel for one of these slichot. And so every night, and usually they start around midnight, every night at the kotel for at least a week before Rosh Hashanah, sometimes longer, the kotel is packed with people saying slichot. And again, the main focus of the slichot are the 13 midot rachamim. Because when God revealed these 13 midot, he said it wasn't just for this incident of the golden calf, that this was the formula, we use the word formula, that when we want to elicit God's compassion, this is what we should say. This is what we should say. Just like when we want to encapsulate the idea of God being one. So we have the Shema. That's we'll call it the formula. And the 13 midot of rachamim, that is the formula to elicit God's compassion. So all during Elul and Rosh Hashanah through Yom Kippur, we're using the 13 midot of rachamim. But it really starts in the month of Av, because in many, many congregations, the month is not called just Av, it's called Menachem Av, consoling the Father. That's the literal translation, consoling the Father. Menachem, it comes from the word Nachem. Nachem means to console. Or in the Haftorah that we read right after Tisha B'Av, it's called Nachamu. Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, Yomar Hashem Elokechem. That God will have a double portion of compassion on his people. We always read this after Tisha B'Av for obvious reasons, but the root of Nachamu is Nachem. Nachem is very close to Rachem. Rachem is the root of Rachamim. So these are connected. So Rav Ginsberg taught one time, and it really stuck with me. He said, every person should have 3 levels of compassion. He said the first one is on every human being. That when a soul comes down to the body, a soul from the upper worlds, a pristine soul comes down into a physical, material, somewhat flawed, broken, challenging material world, every person deserves a measure of rachamim for our just being here. That in itself is a very deep idea. Secondly, he said, we should have compassion on every Jew because of our long and difficult history. Every Jew, religious, not religious, holy, maybe seemingly not so holy, because of our history, it's fitting to have compassion on every Jew. And the third is we should all have compassion on God. Because if we can imagine, God gave us free will. It's one of the greatest gifts that God gave us, along with life, is free will. That we have the opportunity to earn being in the image of God. It's also our greatest challenge. But once God decided that's the rules of the game, so God also plays by the rules of the game. Now, of course, God can supersede his own rules. We know that at any time, at any point, for any person. But basically, we're told that God created the world to run according to the laws that he set up, just like the laws of nature run in a dependable way. They can be superseded in certain circumstances, but basically, the world runs according to a very strict order. And it's the same thing with free will. God gave us free will, and kind of has to, like parents have to sometimes let children struggle in order to become who they are. We can't always clean up their messes. We can't always figure things out for them. So we should have compassion on God, because is the world the way we have it now really what we think God envisioned when he created the world? I don't think so. I don't think so. That's a whole discussion in of itself. Paradox of paradoxes. And on one hand, everything is exactly the way it is and should be. And God's providence is over everything. And God's involvement is all inclusive. And paradoxically, at the same time, we have free will. This we won't go into deeper. So this was just to point out that Av, of course, the 9 days This is all about having compassion on every Jew for our history. That's what we did during the 3 weeks, is really felt. But we also menachem av, that we should also, actually, it says in the Gemara that in God's inner chamber, he cries over the destruction of the temple. It's like a parent who feels they have to punish or ground their children in order to teach them these basic lessons that are good for them. And the expression is, well, sometimes it hurts the parents more than it hurts the children to have to do this. So that's what the Gemara means, is that God was very involved in destroying the temple. But God is crying that he had to destroy the temple. So the 13 midot of Rachamim run through Av, Elul, and Tishrei. Now, another idea which is very, very important, this is something we've learned before, I will mention it again, that one of the basic teachings of the Baal Shem Tov is called Hachna'ah, Havdalah, Hamtakah. Submission, separation, sweetening. And the Baal Shem taught that every process, material, physical, or spiritual, runs through this process called submission, separation, sweetening. The example, very, very simply, is if a person wants to accomplish something, they have to submit their time and their effort and their will to doing it. We can think, I want to do X, but if we don't submit to what needs to be done, nothing happens. So the first stage is always submission, hachna'ah. The second is havdalah, which means separation. Once I want to accomplish something, it could be something that I need to accomplish in 10 minutes or 10 weeks or 10 years. But we're going to go through this process. And the separation is every day, every hour, I have to make separations between what is good to accomplish this task and what is going to take me away from it. That's called making separations. And the sweetening is when we accomplish what we accomplish, that it's what we thought and hoped it would be. How many times do we set out to do something with high hopes and we actually accomplish it, but it doesn't turn out to be exactly what we thought it would be. And sometimes, after putting like a year into something, a project, and it's like, wow, this didn't work. But when it does work, that's called the sweetening. And we'll call it the cherry on top is the acknowledgement and recognition and the ability to thank God. Thank you so much for helping me accomplish this. I did it, but without your help, no, I couldn't have done it. Thank you so much, Hashem. That's called sweetening. So why am I bringing this up here? So the 3 months that we're talking about follow this flow. Av, the month of Av, of the 3 weeks and the fasting and the calamities and sitting on the floor, this is obviously hachna'ah. This is submitting to the reality of Jewish history. Elul is all about separation. The whole month of Elul is about what do we have to do to improve ourselves? What do we have to do to fix ourselves? What separations do I have to make in the way I'm doing things? Introspection, contemplation, tshuva. These are all processes of clarification. That's what separation means, to clarify, to clarify. And then we get to Tishrei, This is the sweetening. Now, this needs a little explanation because from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, I call Yomim Nora'im, the days of awe. How do we call this sweetening? Well, in the inner dimension, it really is sweetening. Why? It's a new year. And we believe that God will listen to our prayers. And we believe that we can start again. And we believe we can do tshuva. And on Yom Kippur, we can be atoned for and purified. Yom Kippur is called one of the 2 happiest days of the year. Now, most people would not initially think of Yom Kippur as one of the happiest days of the year. But really it is. Now, if you would daven with a Hasidic minyan, you would see that the prayers of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are very joyous. Now, there are moments of pure awe, and like the Ari said, like very fitting to shed tears. But nonetheless, the big theme on Rosh Hashanah is we're coronating God King. And that is a very joyous experience. So some of the greatest nigunim come from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Some of the most classic Hasidic nigunim are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But within the month of Tishrei itself, we could see Hachna'ah, Havdalah, and Hamtakah. This is also a very obvious one, is from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. This is submission. We're submitting our will to God's will. The 4 days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot is when we make this, it's called the separation. It's when we make a transition from the days of awe to the days of joy. Sukkot is called Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. And that, of course, is the sweetening. After the whole month of Av, and then Elul, and then Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we finally get to Sukkot, and that's called Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. That is the true sweetening. So this was our introductory class of the 4-part series. Next week, next week, there is no class. I actually posted this already in the WhatsApp. It will be posted again in the WhatsApp. You'll get an email. No class next week. After that, we go 3 straight weeks until Rosh Hashanah. So next week, God willing, we are going to delve into the 9 principles of faith of Chassidut. This is like very innovative, very, very, very deep. For those who are here at the beginning of the class, you'll understand why we're going to be doing that. Anyways, thank you all for coming. We end with a blessing always. And the blessing is that we should always feel God's compassion pouring down on us like a nachal, like a stream. And you don't have to wait to Hanukkah to envision standing in a waterfall of God's light descending upon us. May we all merit to that. Jump in.